Hippocampus. The hippocampus is one of the oldest and least threatening creatures in ocean mythology, which is fitting because it was never meant to frighten anyone. Half horse, half fish, it served as the mount of Poseidon himself, a pair of them pulling his chariot across the Mediterranean while their golden manes trailed through the surf and their scaled tails churned white water behind them. The ancient Greeks and Romans covered their floors, coins, and walls with depictions of it, and the creature appeared frequently enough in the work of the poet Pindar in the 5th century BC that it was clearly a familiar image to any educated person of the era. When modern neuroscientists named a curved structure deep inside the human brain, they reached back for this exact creature, the seahorse shape of the hippocampus visible enough in cross-section to earn the title permanently. Benevolent, decorative, divine, it is the ocean's least alarming resident. Merfolk. Merfolk are so old and so universal that their existence across completely unconnected cultures suggests something deep in the human relationship with the sea. The earliest known mermaid figure is Atargatis, an Assyrian goddess from around 1000 BC who transformed herself out of grief after accidentally killing her human lover, her lower body becoming fish while her human half remained. Across Greek, African, Caribbean, Chinese, and Northern European traditions, the creature kept reappearing with minor variations, sometimes benevolent, sometimes deadly, never entirely safe. Christopher Columbus wrote in his 1493 journal that he spotted 3 mermaids near the Caribbean coast, describing them as not as beautiful as depicted, which historians believe was almost certainly a manatee sighting. The medieval period collapsed sirens and mermaids into a single creature, and Hans Christian Andersen's 1837 story locked in the modern image permanently. They are the ocean's most famous residents and its most ambiguous ones. Selkie. The selkie is not a monster story. It is a tragedy. In the folklore of Scotland, Ireland, the Faroe Islands, and Iceland, selkies are seals in the ocean and humans on land, the transformation possible only by shedding their seal skin on shore. The horror of the myth is not what they do, but what is done to them. If a human finds and hides a selkie skin, the selkie is stranded on land indefinitely, unable to return to the sea, sometimes forced into marriage, always described as melancholy and distant, staring at the water. If they ever find the hidden skin, they return immediately and are never seen again. The ballad, The Great Silkie of Sulskeri, one of the oldest recorded versions of the story and particularly strong in the Orkney Islands, captures this perfectly. The selkie does not haunt, it grieves. That is somehow worse. Nixie. The Nixie, known as the Nix in German, the Knack in Swedish, and the Nuke in Norwegian, is a shape-shifting water spirit that lives in rivers, lakes, and coastal waters throughout Germanic and Scandinavian folklore. Its preferred disguise is devastatingly effective, a beautiful musician often playing violin with a skill so extraordinary that anyone who hears it cannot stop listening and cannot stop walking toward the water. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm documented Nixie folklore extensively in the 19th century, finding consistent accounts across the region of unexplained drownings near water where beautiful music had reportedly been heard. Some traditions hold that a Nixie can be appeased with food offerings, which is either reassuring or implies that local communities were regularly leaving food at riverbanks to negotiate with something they genuinely believed was there. The music stops the moment you are under the surface. Rusalka. The Rusalka is what happens when a young woman dies violently or before her time near water. In Slavic mythology across Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus, she does not pass on. She stays. She haunts the river or lake where she drowned, emerging at night to dance at the forest's edge, her hair permanently wet, her feet never fully dry. Men who stumble across her dancing are compelled to join and dance until they collapse and die. In early pagan Slavic tradition, she was actually a fertility spirit, associated with water and agricultural abundance, respected during a calendar holiday called Rusalia, when communities left offerings to keep her pleased. The Christianization of Slavic culture slowly darkened her, transforming the water spirit into something vengeful and predatory. Antonin Dvořák's 1901 opera, Rusalka remains the most famous cultural adaptation of the myth, though it softens her considerably. The original does not. Siren. Most people picture a mermaid when they hear the word siren, which is exactly wrong. In Homer's Odyssey, written around the 8th century BC, Sirens have the body of a bird and the face of a woman, creatures of the air that nest on an island surrounded by the bones and rotting flesh of sailors. Their song is not seductive in any romantic sense. It is simply irresistible. Sailors hear it and steer directly into the rocks, trying to reach the source, not out of desire but out of helpless compulsion. Odysseus survived by having his crew plug their ears with wax and lash him to the mast, unable to act on the song regardless of his orders. The Argonauts survived differently because Orpheus played music more beautiful than the Sirens' song and drowned it out, after which, according to some accounts, the Sirens threw themselves into the sea. The fishtail came later, a medieval conflation with mermaids that has now almost entirely replaced the original image. Jengu and Mami Wata. The Jenguas are water spirits from the Sawa people of Cameroon, described as beautiful beings with long flowing hair and a distinctive gap-toothed smile who live at the boundary of rivers and sea. Unlike most ocean creatures in mythology, they are predominantly benevolent, bringers of good fortune, healers of disease, intermediaries between the human world and the spirit world. The broader figure of Mami Wata, a Pan-African water spirit found across West and Central Africa, carries a more complex duality. She is depicted as a mermaid or a snake charmer, associated with wealth, healing, and deep water, capable of great generosity toward those devoted to her, and catastrophic punishment toward those who betray her trust. Crucially, Mami Wata is not a historical artifact. Active shrines are maintained across West Africa and throughout the African diaspora, in the Caribbean and South America, a living religious tradition that spread across the Atlantic through the slave trade. She is one of the most geographically widespread water deities on Earth, Taniwha. In Maori mythology, the Taniwha is a supernatural being of enormous size that inhabits the deepest parts of oceans, rivers, and lakes across New Zealand. Its nature is entirely dependent on how it is treated. Some Taniwha are fierce protectors of their iwai, guiding canoes safely through dangerous water and warning communities of approaching threats. Others are described as predators that capsize boats and drag people to their deaths. They shapeshift regularly, appearing as sharks, whales, enormous logs, or floating islands, which means a calm stretch of water is never entirely what it appears. The Taniwha Kaiwar is said to protect Manukau Harbor, and his presence is documented by Te Ara, the New Zealand government's official encyclopedia. What makes the Taniwha genuinely distinct from most entries on this list is that belief in them has influenced real legal and environmental decisions in modern New Zealand, with specific Taniwha territories acknowledged in resource management consultations. This is not an ancient myth. It is an ongoing relationship. Abaia. The Abaia is an enormous magical eel from the oral traditions of Fiji, the Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu, and it does not threaten humans unprovoked. It lives at the bottom of specific lakes on these islands and considers every fish in that lake its child. Harm none of them, and the Abaia leaves you entirely alone. Catch its fish, or worse, harm them deliberately, and the Abaia triggers catastrophic flooding and storms that drown the offenders. The creature is essentially a force of environmental enforcement, its power not directed at people, but at the consequences of what people do to the water around it. The lake it inhabits becomes sacred by association, a no-harm zone enforced by something ancient at the bottom. In a part of the world where freshwater sources are surrounded by open ocean and survival depends entirely on the health of the local ecosystem, the Abaia encodes a very practical piece of wisdom inside a monster story. Bakunawa. The Bakunawa is a sea serpent from Visayan mythology in the Philippines, and its scale is not measured in meters but in celestial objects. According to tradition, this creature, described as having a mouth the size of a lake, a red tongue, and scales that fan outward like wings, emerged from the ocean to devour the moon. It did this multiple times. In some accounts, there were originally 7 moons in the sky, and the Bakunawa swallowed 6 of them before it was stopped, leaving only 1. During actual lunar eclipses, Filipino communities historically responded by banging pots, drums, and loud instruments to frighten the Bakunawa into spitting the moon back out. A tradition documented by Spanish colonial missionaries who arrived in the Philippines in the 16th century. The connection between a sea creature and the sky above it is unusual in ocean mythology. The Bakunawa is not content with the water. It reaches upward. Isanade. The Isanade comes from the coastal folklore of Kyushu, Japan, particularly around the waters near the Goto Islands, and it is remarkable for what it does not do. It does not roar. It does not surface dramatically. It does not announce itself. Described as an enormous shark-like creature so large it is mistaken for a small island from a distance, the Isanade approaches boats silently from below and uses its barbed, hook-shaped tail to sweep sailors off the deck and into the water, then drags them under. Its name translates roughly as to stroke the shore, a description of that sweeping tail motion. Fishermen in the region reportedly refused to sail on certain nights specifically out of fear of it, according to accounts preserved in the Hakumonogatari Kaidenkai storytelling tradition. The creature itself is almost never fully seen. It is a shadow, a shape, a sudden absence of someone who was standing there a moment ago. Bunyip. The Bunyip is one of the strangest entries in any survey of mythological creatures, because it blurs the line between myth and recorded history in an uncomfortable way. In the traditions of multiple Australian Aboriginal groups, it is a creature that inhabits swamps, creek beds, and riverbeds, described with wildly inconsistent physical features across different communities: dog-like face, horsetail, flippers, walrus tusks, and a nighttime roar that functions as a death omen. European settlers in the 19th century complicated things considerably. In 1847, a skull of unknown origin was put on public display in Melbourne and reported to resemble descriptions of the Bunyip, causing genuine public debate covered by multiple newspapers, including the Port Phillip Gazette. Some researchers have proposed that the myth may preserve a racial memory of extinct Australian megafauna like the Diprotodon, though this remains a contested theory. The appearance varies. The drowning does not. Scylla. Scylla began as a beautiful nymph and ended as something with 12 feet, 6 heads on long necks, 3 rows of teeth in each head, and the lower half of her body replaced by a ring of 6 snarling dogs. Depending on the source, this transformation was the work of the sorceress Circe, who poisoned the water Scylla bathed in out of jealousy, or of Amphitrite, Poseidon's wife, for similar reasons. Homer describes her in the Odyssey, placing her on a cliff above the Strait of Messina, the narrow channel between Sicily and mainland Italy, directly across from Charybdis. Odysseus was told explicitly that sailing closer to Scylla was the rational choice. She would take 6 men, 1 to each head, but the ship would survive. He did sail closer. She did take 6 men, plucking them from their oars mid-stroke. According to one tradition, Heracles killed her, and her father Phorcys simply brought her back. She cannot be permanently dealt with. She can only be survived. Charybdis. If Scylla is a precise and countable threat, Charybdis is the opposite. According to Greek tradition, she was originally a daughter of Poseidon and the earth goddess Gaia, transformed by Zeus into a monster as punishment for stealing the cattle of Heracles and flooding the lands with seawater. Her final form is essentially a whirlpool, a massive formless vortex that swallows the entire sea 3 times per day and expels it 3 times per day, creating catastrophic maelstreams on a regular schedule. There's no fighting it, there's no negotiating with it, there's only timing. Odysseus survived her a second time in the Odyssey by clinging to a fig tree above the whirlpool as it swallowed his raft, then dropping back down when the water returned. The phrase "bided between Scylla and Charybdis," meaning caught between 2 equally devastating options, passed from Greek mythology into Latin, into medieval European languages, and eventually into modern English as the expression "between a rock and a hard place." Some scholars believe Charybdis was inspired by a real whirlpool called the Garofalo near the Strait of Messina, Aspidochelone. The Aspidochelone is a whale or giant sea turtle. The sources disagree on which, so enormous that its back has accumulated enough soil, sand, and vegetation over the centuries to resemble a genuine island. Sailors find it, mistake it for land, anchor their ships to it, and light fires to cook their meals. The warmth wakes the creature. It dives. Everyone drowns. The name comes from the Greek words for shield and turtle, and the story first appears in the Physiologus, an early Christian text compiled somewhere between the 2nd and 4th century AD, where it served as a direct theological allegory. The Aspidochelone represents the devil, who creates the illusion of safety and stability to trap the unwary before pulling them to destruction. The concept spread further and faster than almost any other sea monster idea in history, appearing in Arabic texts as the Zaratan, in Old English as Fastatokelon, in the poem that later influenced Tolkien, in Norse sagas, and in the legend of Saint Brendan, the Irish monk who reportedly landed on a similar creature during his famous ocean voyage. Hydra. The Hydra lived in the lake of Lerna in the Argolid region of Greece, a bottomless body of water connected to the sea, and it was the second of the 12 labors assigned to Heracles by King Eurystheus. Homer gives it 9 heads. Later sources range from 5 to 100, with the middle head universally described as immortal. The defining mechanic was the problem: cut 1 head off and 2 grew back in its place, which meant every conventional attack made the creature stronger. Heracles solved it with fire, having his nephew Islaus cauterize each neck stump with a torch immediately after each decapitation, preventing regeneration before burying the immortal head under a boulder. He then dipped his arrows in the Hydra's blood, which was fatally toxic, a decision that paid dividends in later labors and eventually contributed to his own death when a poison garment was used against him years later. Some scholars read the myth as an allegory for the real draining of the Lerna swamps, the heads representing the way marshland kept reclaiming ground when not properly managed. Jörmungandr. Jörmungandr is not the size of a large animal or even a large island. It is the size of the world. One of the 3 children of Loki and the giantess Angerboda, it was cast into the ocean surrounding Midgard by Odin shortly after birth. Already sensed as a threat beyond ordinary reckoning, it grew in the deep until it encircled the entire world and could bite its own tail, a position it held until the end of time. Thor fished for it once using an ox head as bait, pulling it to the surface in an encounter documented in the Hymiskvidi in the 13th century Poetic Edda, and came close to killing it before being stopped. At Ragnarök, according to the prose, Edda, compiled by Snorri Sturluson, Jörmungandr releases its tail, rises from the ocean, and floods the land simply by surfacing. Its emergence one of the signs that the end of the world has begun. Thor and the serpent are fated to kill each other. Thor lands the killing blow, walks 9 steps, and dies from the venom. The serpent gets the last word. Cetus. Cetus was the divine instrument of Poseidon's punishment, sent to ravage the coast of Ethiopia after Queen Cassiopeia declared she was more beautiful than the Nereids, Poseidon's sea nymphs, an offense the god could not overlook. The oracle's answer was blunt. Chain your daughter Andromeda to a sea rock and let the creature have her, or watch the destruction continue indefinitely. King Cepheus complied. Perseus arrived by air, reportedly on the winged horse Pegasus, carrying the severed head of Medusa, and turned the Cetus to stone before it reached Andromeda. Ovid describes the encounter in Book 4 of the Metamorphoses. The creature's physical form was deliberately ambiguous in ancient sources and depictions, appearing variously as part serpent, part dog, part fish, sometimes with donkey-like ears, a formless divine terror rather than a specific animal. The word Cetus passed directly into Latin, and from there into the scientific classification Cetacea, the order name for all whales and dolphins, meaning every time a biologist names a whale species, they are, technically, invoking this myth. Kraken. The Kraken entered formal written record in 1752 when Erik Pontoppidan, the Bishop of Bergen, described it in his Natural History of Norway as a creature over a mile wide in circumference, so large that sailors had logged it as undiscovered land before it submerged. Early Norwegian accounts describe fishermen actively seeking it out because the extraordinary concentration of fish drawn to the nutrients around its body made for unrivaled catches, which means the relationship between humans and the Kraken was, at various points, one of the most dangerous fishing trips imaginable undertaken on purpose. Its most destructive weapon was not its arms, but its dive. The whirlpool created when it descended was large enough to pull ships down with it. The giant squid, Architeuthis ducks, reaching lengths of up to 13 meters and capable of leaving sucker scars on sperm whales, is the near-universal candidate for the real animal behind the legend. Tennyson wrote a poem called The Kraken in 1830, describing it sleeping in the deep until the last fire at the end of the world finally wakes it. Leviathan. Leviathan is described in Job 41 with a specificity no other sea creature in mythology receives. The scales are locked together so tightly that no air passes between them. The breath sets coals ablaze. Smoke rises from the nostrils. The eyes are like the rays of dawn. The sea boils like a pot where it passes. This is not vague terror. This is documentation. In the context of the book of Job, the Leviathan is God's evidence that human understanding has limits. God asks Job directly, "Can you draw out the Leviathan with a hook? Can you put a cord through its nose?" The answer is no, and that no is the entire point. In later Jewish tradition, its role shifted toward eschatology. At the end of days, God will slay the Leviathan, and its flesh will be served as a feast for the righteous. The Ugaritic myth of Baal defeating Lotin, a seven-headed sea serpent, is considered a direct predecessor. Thomas Hobbes used Leviathan as the title and central metaphor of his 1651 treatise on political philosophy. The monster as the state, its power absolute and unchallengeable. That this creature crossed from ancient scripture into political theory and stayed there says something about what the ocean, at its deepest, has always represented. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.